So let's get right to it, Bob. The CBO budget outlook shows some pretty serious deficit reduction happening with the federal budget next year. That's good, right?
It is. But overall, I hate to say, it's not a good news report. You do see the budget deficit coming down dramatically this year and then going down again next year. And so far, so good. But the really significant point about this new updated 10-year baseline, which again assumes that there are no changes in policy, it's just CBO is saying what would happen if nothing changes, consistent with our economic assumptions as well. So what we see is the deficit continues to come down next year, but then begins to go back up again in 2024 and continues an upward path pretty much throughout the 10 years. And that's really the significant point, because what's happening is that the budget deficit is coming down significantly now because it went up significantly. It really spiked in 2020 and 2021 because of the pandemic and responses to the pandemic. So there were economic and legislative effects there so you got to sort of discount those couple of years because they were anomalies. So what's happening now is we're kind of rejoining a pattern that we had before the pandemic, which was not a good pattern. It was one of underlying structurally rising budget deficits. And so the deficit was already high to begin with going into the pandemic. And so by 2024, we start going back up again.
So if you're the Biden administration and you're claiming, hey, look, we've reduced deficit spending, to you, that's a bit of a red herring, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're taking advantage. I mean, I would do it too. If you were president, you would claim credit for something good that's happening.
Right.
But it's something that is happening naturally because the pandemic spending is winding down and the economy is recovering. So we've really been getting a lot of revenue. We've been getting CBO is not really quite sure why we're getting so much revenue coming in. So that is why the budget deficit is looking good. But again, when I say looking good, it goes back to a quote unquote normal of $1 trillion,
right,
which a few years ago we would have considered astronomical. Mm-hmm. And, as a percentage of GDP, which is the best way to look at these things, you're looking at consistent budget deficits well above 5%, hitting around 6% within 10 years, which again, the average over the past 50 years has been 3.5%. So we're talking about all this budget, deficit reduction is leaving us at a place that's already worse than normal.
So when the Concord Coalition put out our press release on the budget outlook, when it came out, you mentioned in that this baseline that the CBO has just released has four major assumptions that are problematic. Now, recognizing that the CBO has to put out an outlook for the next 10 years that is based on current law, so it's not necessarily their fault. But can you go through those four assumptions that are problematic that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, and of course, baselines are all about assumptions because they're going out 10 years, and the further out you go, the more uncertain they become, particularly in times like this. But because of the scoring conventions that CBO is required to follow, they don't make predictions of what is going to happen. They just say, if nothing changes, this is what we think is going to happen. So they follow current law, quote unquote. And they follow the letter of the law. There are a lot of things going on right now, which could make these already bad projections worse. So this could actually be an optimistic or even best case scenario. And among those are, they don't anticipate any more spending for COVID. I mean, they basically say COVID's over. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's probably going to be some more emergency spending on COVID. We don't know how much, but a bigger factor in that regard is the war in Ukraine. We've already spent almost $60 billion this year on that conflict, and national security experts are telling us it's going to be a prolonged conflict. And so, there's an open question about how much are we going to be spending, an extra 60 billion a year. That's a lot of money. And so another thing that Tori will talk more about is that they assume that a lot of tax cuts that were enacted in 2017 are going to expire on schedule in 2025. Unlikely that that's going to happen. So that could be, so the baseline assumes a gusher of revenues beyond 2025 that may well not happen. And the other thing I'd want to mention is that they essentially assume a soft landing, that the Fed will be able to tamp down inflation without causing a recession. Everybody hopes that that will happen. They hope that they can pull it off, but everybody will acknowledge that that's historically been very, very difficult to do. So the CBO, they don't anticipate recessions. They don't say we think a recession is going to happen. So, you could get one. And so the economics could not work out quite the way CBO wants. And that would have not wants, but I mean, they're projecting. So that could be an optimistic scenario as well.
So since you mentioned Tori, I definitely want to turn to you now, Tori, but I guess before we do that, what's the big picture message, Bob, taking a look at this, that policymakers, lawmakers, taxpayers need to understand? What's the takeaway from this CBO baseline that's been released?
Well, it really reveals the extent to which we're on an unsustainable track, that we've been, it isn't COVID. It's not the war in Ukraine. It's that we have an underlying baseline that is unsustainable. Spending is going to grow faster than revenues under current law. And so unless we take policy actions, unless we specifically try to mitigate that trend, stop it, reverse it, whatever, our budget deficits and debt will be on an unsustainable track, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the consequences are worse for future generations. So really, it's the message for policymakers is it is up to us to change the laws now to produce a